Welcome back to this second session of this one-day conference. And please disregard at the moment anything which is going on the screen, just dealing with a couple of technical issues. But following on from the talks given in the past session, in this session we're going to be looking at a few more strategic points with regards to intercity, intracity connections and strategic thinking to deal with the crises that were mentioned by Joseph at the start of the morning. Now we have a packed couple of hours. We'll get some chance for some questions and answers, and a little bit of discussion as well, and commentary after the first talk and towards the end of the session. But just very briefly, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Sir John Elvidge, who needs no introduction. I'm just going to mention a couple of brief points. Sir John, in the early Blair years, was actually responsible for the coordination of UK domestic policy in the Cabinet Secretariat, and a lot of his more recent work has been associated with Scotland and Scottish politics. Sir John's the former permanent secretary to the Scottish government and the former head of the Scottish Civil Service, and is currently, and quite fittingly with regards to the previous discussions that we've just had, previous talks that we've just heard, is currently chairman of the corporation that runs Edinburgh Airport, and is also involved in a wide range of international public policy work and other types of advisory roles. So without further ado.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I have agreed to try, in the space of 15 minutes, to run through what I count as 6 connected propositions. So I shall describe all 6 to you before I drill down into any of them. First, that we have wholly lost our confidence around urban policy and spatial planning as a culture, both in government and outside it. That the reasons for that are not specific to urban policy, but are shared with economic policy and social policy, and that their roots may be more strongly observed. The roots of that loss of confidence may be more strongly observable in social policy, and that may be the infecting source, as it were. Although interactions between social policy and urban policy are a significant part of that loss of confidence. The loss of confidence does rest on some objectively identifiable failures, and that those failures are not surprising because they are inherent in the way in which we and just about every other country in the world structures government. They are the products of inherent systemic flaws in the way in which we structure government. That we will not restore confidence unless we address that systemic issue and help rebuild the ability to deliver convincing outcomes from government and, in a sense, to reclaim the right to a strategic role. And that as part of reclaiming the right to the strategic role, we must rethink the relationship between the state and the citizen around the micro-dynamics of the functioning of our cities. So those are the propositions. The first of them, judging by what I heard when I came in partway through the first session, is one I don't need to explain. I'm not sure that it's a subject of contention. That we and other governments have lost confidence in this territory, but if it turns out to be, we can deal with that in the Q&A session. Why did we lose confidence? I find it helpful to look back over the entire post-war period and look at a series of major public policy issues which have been pursued consistently by governments of different, where reasonably similar objectives have been pursued consistently by governments of varying political views with differing policy instruments and with widely differing levels of resourcing, including some periods of apparently generous resourcing. The four areas of underperformance that I find it helpful to focus on for this purpose are that health inequalities have grown over the period, although between socioeconomic groups, although it's been the explicit objective of governments for several decades to produce the reverse effect, and that the most marked manifestations of that are in our cities. That successful education systems by international standards have consistently failed to deliver any worthwhile outcome for approximately 30% of each age cohort of young people, and again the manifestations of that are most strongly observable in our cities. That we have made no impact worth speaking of on narrowing variations in economic growth between the component parts of the UK. That London and the South East are moving further away than they ever were, despite the fact that governments of all complexions have worked very hard and often with novel policy instruments to produce precisely the opposite effect. And coming closest to cities, the concentrations of economic and social disadvantage in our cities are by and large of the same size and in the same geographical locations as they were 4 decades ago, despite sustained periods of government activity designed to produce the reverse effect. I argue, therefore, that there is an objective basis for loss of confidence in ourselves and, more importantly, loss of public confidence in the capacity of government to deliver high-level strategic objectives. To translate that specifically in the context of cities, I see a disconnect between our relative success in the physical renewal of cities, particularly in the post-war years. There are some things we regret, but by and large, we have good reason to feel more confident about many of the things we did than things we regret. But we proved not nearly as successful in managing the social dynamics of those renewed cities as we were in reconstructing their physical fabric. And it's in that area that I think our failure is most obvious and persistent. And the next step in my argument is that that failure is systemically probable, given the way that we organise ourselves. We, and pretty much every country in the world, organise government on essentially the same principle: a loose federation of functional entities designed to deal with each of the major dimensions of public policy. So pretty much every country in the world has a Ministry of Justice, a Ministry of Education, a Ministry of Health, a Ministry of some form of Economic Affairs, etc., etc. It's quite astonishing that internationally we find so little variation in the basic architecture of our governments. And it was an architecture that worked well for most countries at a particular phase of development. It's an architecture that delivers success in relation to 60 or 70% of the observed problem in most cases. The trouble is, when you are, as we are, at the end of 6 decades of deploying that architecture, and you've hit that 60-70% success rate, then the shortcomings of the model are what come to the fore, because that model is, for observable reasons, are almost incapable of dealing with issues that cross functional domains. It's a truism of public policy. I'm not sure I'm capable of remembering a decade in which the call for more joined-up government wasn't a central argument of public policy. But the fact that that has been so for at least 4 decades might provide some clue to the fact that however much people articulate the need, they continue to see an absence of the practice. And that is not stupidity or wrong-headedness or a desire to sabotage the functionings of society. It is a natural product of organising yourself around different value systems, different analytical frameworks, and different incentive systems. Of course, ministries of education behave differently from ministries of justice. They inhabit entirely different intellectual worlds, which only meet at the point of the problems of a minority of the population, and so the incentive structure for abandonment of intellectual frameworks that work well for the majority of the problem is not strong. So we shouldn't be in the least surprised. Where government has felt that it's an option simply to withdraw from territories in response to what we might call the manifestation of diminishing returns, it's done so. Almost no developed country any longer maintains a belief in the management of the economy by government. Some form of neoliberalism, some form of dependence on macroeconomic management rather than direct intervention in the functioning of the economy is now a more or less universal belief. And similarly, it was possible to withdraw from urban policy and physical planning policy. It's only in social policy that it's not deemed possible to withdraw, and that's why one sees the continuing struggle to reconcile structures that are in their essence unifunctional with problems that are in their essence multidimensional. So there is a pressing need to find a systemic answer to that problem. Now, I'm not going to take the time to tell you what has happened in Scotland to try to provide that, because it's very difficult to do that within the boundaries of the 15 minutes, except to say that it consists essentially of two fundamental elements: the creation of a single shared strategic structure for the whole public sector, so that every part of the public sector, irrespective of what its function is, works within the same highly articulated structure of strategic objectives and measurement of impact on those strategic objectives, and an attempt to both restructure central government and redefine central government's relationship both with local government and with the vast army of bodies that are spin-offs of central government. So, a single high-level strategic structure and an attempt to redefine relationships, including what we call for shorthand in Scotland the abolition of government departments, the abolition of the concept of government departments, this standard organisational model that everybody uses. Let me finish by going to the renegotiation of the relationship between the state and citizens. It's an extension of my argument that in response to our loss of confidence in the strategic domain, our response has been to redirect our energies further and further down the chain of micro interactions between the state and citizens. And a consequence of that is that the state has entered territory which is contested. There are many things which the state does which, at least in the context of our society, we wouldn't wish to argue that anyone else should do. There are natural domains for the state. But the state has moved significantly beyond those boundaries with the best of intentions. And now we have an evidential picture that suggests that because of the fundamental structural issues I've described, the state is not particularly successful in some of those complex domains. And we've begun to see some evidence that communities themselves, confronted by that lack of success, have been moved to self-organise and to create responses of their own, which are arguably more successful than the efforts of the state. That's not a universal truth, of course. The picture's mixed. It's very hard to find examples where the state is successful, but there is a variation in how successful the community organised alternatives are. So it's not a simple panacea. But it seems to me that we should be more willing to embrace the view that self-organisation by communities might deliver us some better responses at the micro level of interactions, particularly in cities, and that we should use that potential for success to enable us both to free ourselves up to go back to the strategic territory and to negotiate a new interrelationship between the management of the strategic and the management of micro-social interactions in our cities. That's it. That is my set of arguments.
Well, thank you very much for that, Sir John. And we now have 5 or so minutes for a few questions from the audience.
You're welcome all to agree.
If I may just perhaps kick off with a quick question. I mean, you mentioned this idea of government departments, sectors, categories, etc., not being able to deal with what you term evident complex domains, and the need to move back perhaps towards the community level in terms of, perhaps solving or tackling some of these issues. Can you mention perhaps, I don't know, maybe from your work in Scotland, any case where this has worked and perhaps, where it hasn't?
Where the attempt to reintegrate has my ability to reel off a list of areas where it hasn't worked is constrained only by my memory and by the length of time of which I've been looking at attempts to do it and their failure. I guess we might cite the urban programme as an example of a sustained effort that produced little in the way of measurable beneficial outcomes. In different parts of the UK, we had long-term programmes of structured intervention in our cities. Once we'd identified these concentrations of social disadvantage, using slightly different tools north and south of the border, we pursued long-term meaning somewhere between 5 and 10 years, programmes of attempts to intervene in that. There were ideas built into those attempts that still seem fundamentally right, that improving people's employment prospects might be a fundamentally beneficial part of changing the dynamic. But we consistently failed to be able to understand the interaction of forces in the lives of individual households. So we became puzzled that our single function offerings, here's a souped up employment service to help you find jobs. We became puzzled that didn't do the trick because we remained incapable of understanding the way in which that was interacting, not just financially with the benefits system, but with the other issues around health, around forms of social organisation, around education, around the barriers to geographical mobility that were equally parts of the equation. If to be more optimistic, the example of success that's at the forefront of my mind, and you'll forgive me if it's a recent and Scottish example, because I've spent a certain amount of time asking myself whether the things we've done in Scotland make any difference to anything. So I'm quite interested in the evidence of actual progress. Some of the stuff around early intervention with children born into circumstances that give them objectively the worst life chances in society are beginning to show very promising results in terms of both the observable cooperation between public sector sources, but also some of the early indicators. And by definition, they can only be early indicators. But you've got measures of educational progress that give you some early signals of whether you might be getting somewhere or not. And the evidence suggests that it is. And also evidence of early offending going down significantly is quite strong. At the risk of giving you too long an answer, can I just contrast that with the effects of Sure Start, an equally well-meaning programme aimed at essentially the same problem, but what the evidence tells us is that advantaged households are better at deriving benefit from that programme than disadvantaged ones are. So yes, yes, it is capable of doing good for disadvantaged households, but less good than it does for advantaged ones. So it ends up reinforcing relative disadvantage, rather than curing it.
You mentioned that you were puzzled by how governments are sort of organized very similar across the world. They are organized vertically in the problems like jobs or skills or cities are sort of horizontal. How would you organize them differently? I mean, is there any other way to organize them?
Well, in Scotland we have. We've pushed functionality further down the structure. Of course, there has to be a level of functional organisation. You can't have several thousand people turning up in the morning, with a kind of wholly flexible portfolio of what they're there to do. So yes, of course, you build functionality into the system, but taking it right to the top of your system is unnecessary. So in Scotland, we've redefined what the more senior levels of government do to say, in effect, functionality is sufficiently easy that responsibility for it can stop in a vertical sense further down government structures, and integration is difficult, and therefore that will be the responsibility of the more senior members of your structure. So to put it in simpler terms, one morning we said to the head of our education department and the head of our justice department and the head of our health department, you are no longer those things. You are a team responsible for driving integration between the activities of this government. Here's the set of strategic objectives which collectively we have to deliver. It's your job to find new combinations of activity that will deliver those outcomes better than we're currently doing. And that's rational because you are at the level you are because of your capacity for sophisticated systems thinking, and this is essentially a challenge of understanding complex systems and integrating them. So that's that's our alternative. When I'm talking only about that, I have a little kind of 3-test slide about demonstrating that 6 years in you might conclude that it's working, but I won't take up time doing that.
And we have time for another quick question, and we have a questioner here. Those of you who are in the question queue, please bear in mind that we do have some time at the end of the session for your questions as well. So if we could take your time.
Sorry. I'm happy to agree with each of the propositions you made, but just to come back to those propositions in relation to the ways in which the world works. So the first one was around the highly articulate common sets of goals and indicators. But once a politician has a set of indicators and singular articulated goals which they can be judged against, then they find themselves increasingly pressed by an opposition which will press on those things. Therefore, they tend not to want a highly articulated set of goals, but very generic and open ones without any indicators. And the second point is around your second proposition, that is a changed relation between state and citizens, which require then working with local government and closer to community-initiated self-managed groups. But unless you've got a structural means of doing that, it can look like David Cameron's view of what communities should do. That is, they should do it for themselves and let's get government out of the same space. So the very things that you're suggesting, as good, much as I agree with them, actually work within the framework of what you're criticising.
Okay. I absolutely understand that your first point of contention is the conventional analysis, and it's an analysis I would have shared if I didn't have some evidence to the contrary. Alongside the strategic structure I've talked about in Scotland is an accountability framework to the public based on that, which you can Google. Scotland Performs are the words you want, which is a very stark form of accountability against those strategic objectives and the measures chosen to assess them. And it has plenty of red arrows pointing downwards, although it has a majority of green arrows pointing upwards, and strongly evidence-based. The site gives you the ability to drill deep into the supporting evidence for the assessments. Now, all that tells us is that group of politicians had the courage to tackle the accountability problem. The second piece of evidence is that having done this in 2007 with 36% of the seats in the legislature, in 2011 they won an overall majority in the legislature in an electoral system specifically designed to make it almost impossible for any party to achieve a single majority. Now, of course, it would be an absurd hypothesis to attribute their electoral success solely to the fact that they did this. But it does suggest that the damage effect that is widely believed to exist doesn't exist. On the second one, yes, I've written something about all this for the Carnegie UK Trust called The Enabling State. I did think of making the title of the pamphlet Not the Big Society, because of course I'm aware that people will immediately associate the set of ideas with a particular party's political expression of them. I'm more interested not in saying to communities, go on then, get on with it, but in asking quite difficult policy questions about what a government would do if it wished to facilitate that dynamic. What new policy instruments would you create that had the specific objective of doing that? There's a lot of interest in asset transfer as a mechanic, and as it happens, there are manifestations of that in Scotland that are longer lived and therefore offer us more evidence than is the case south of the border. So I think it's undoubtedly part of the toolkit. Very difficult to ask people to undertake significant tasks if they have no asset control as part of that. But there are genuine public policy challenges about what the full toolkit of policy measures would be. I don't pretend to have a complete answer. I simply argue that that's an intellectual challenge worth taking on.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your talk and your